what percentage state aid was when you looked at it compared against total property taxes. And you got those numbers right. UGA, unrestricted general government aid, as compared to property taxes, has gone down significantly as a proportion of what property taxes are. And what that evidence is that more pressure is being put on the local taxpayer. And that's quite obvious with these overrides that we're seeing.
The homeowner taking the brunt of it here. You called this again the perfect storm. I know this year, I read that 54 Massachusetts municipalities have placed 74 Proposition 2.5 override questions on local ballots. They're all in total looking about for $158 million in additional revenue. But as you mentioned, most of these communities, at least the votes that we've had so far, I know here in Western Massachusetts, voters have said, no, we can't pay any more.
Yeah, and that is really sort of like, that's the challenge we have here. I do believe people support local government. They care about public safety, public health, public works, their libraries, parks and playgrounds. But we're in the middle of a national affordability crisis. And asking people to say, yes, I can afford more, a higher property tax bill is a tough question to ask. So I think local officials are faced with tough choices, but I think local voters are being faced with really tough choices in these times.
Sure, exactly. With especially families with children, I know where we are in the town of Southampton. One of the worries is older folks are going to get priced out of their homes just by the property tax. It's a big concern.
Right. I actually did an interview with a reporter for The Economist just yesterday about that very issue. That as the demographic shift to an older population, is the property tax more of a burden on that population? And indeed, it is, right? The tax is based on the value of a home, not your ability to pay. And that makes it harder on local governments as they're trying to pursue more revenue flexibility.
Now, you had mentioned as far as the local option taxes, we've created a structure where expenses simply outpace revenue. And I think we've seen it. Local communities are saying, well, look, health insurance costs are going up, and the cost of education as far as transportation and school choice and things like that. So we're at this point in time. And in the next segment, we're going to talk about more solutions. But the other question I have on this, too, is that I've heard a number of communities saying that the ARPA money that they were receiving back 3 or 4 years ago under COVID kind of put this off. Yep. But the cities and towns that use this money to balance their budgets are now the time's come to pay the piper.
I think that's right. I think ARPA was a great program. Cities large, towns small, all benefited from it and were able to make important investments. One of the things they were allowed to do, though, was use ARPA money to backfill revenue losses that were following COVID, following the pandemic. So I think what folks are telling you is absolutely right. I think some of those ARPA dollars helped sort of delay what was coming in terms of rising costs, fixed revenues. And now that those ARPA dollars have been used or expired, we are now seeing the reality of this shortfall.
This whole thing with the Proposition 2.5 override, so it seems like, at least for now, it's doing nothing more than putting a Band-Aid on a major wound. Property taxes are increasing, but only to fix the problem for the current year.
Yeah, Dave, that is right on. We say it in the report, an override is a costly but expensive, non-permanent solution. It's a temporary solution. Because if hypothetically, if costs are growing up by 4% and revenues are growing up by 3%, if you fix that for a year, and some communities do plan and they ask for enough to cover maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, you're still going to reach a point again where you have to go back to the taxpayer. So without something being done to help cities and towns control some of these non-discretionary expenditures, or helping them with either more state aid or more revenue flexibility, we're gonna be continuing to have this conversation in the years ahead.
Yeah, it's and it seems like, well, it's been going on for the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, every couple of years, these smaller communities, especially the smaller communities, seem to be taking a bigger hit than the cities.
Well, it's interesting. I think Malden, Massachusetts, urban community just north of Boston. They went out for their first override just maybe 3-4 weeks ago, and unfortunately for them, were unsuccessful. So there are urban communities that are facing some of these pressures. at the same time, state aid for through the education formula, Chapter 70 and the Student Opportunity Act, has done a lot to support educational spending in some of the urban communities, whereas suburban and rural communities did not see the same growth in that account. And I think that is around where a lot of these pressures in the more rural communities are coming from now.
Do you think we've become too reliant on state aid?
Well, I don't think we have a choice but to be reliant on
Right.
state aid given the strictures of Prop 2.5. And I want to be clear, I'm not opposed to the concept of Prop 2.5 and having there be controls over year revenue growth. But the whole premise of Prop 2.5 was that property taxes would be controlled, but the state would support communities based on that tax control.
We're going to have to take a break. When we come back, Adam and I are going to talk about the MMA's suggestions for easing the fiscal crisis here in Massachusetts. So stay with us. Welcome back to Western Mass News Getting Answers. My guest this week is the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Municipal Association, Adam Chapdelaine. Adam, the MMA followed up its last fall, the Perfect Storm report, with another report offering a package of steps that you want Beacon Hill to take to support these struggling cities and towns, putting pressure on the legislature to come to their rescue. What are some of the MMA's recommendations?
Great. Happy to talk about them. And yeah, we stuck with the storm theme between the perfect storm and navigating the storm. We put out 3 categories of recommendations, but our biggest priority was asking the state to reinvest in unrestricted general government aid. We spoke earlier about that diminishment from about 11% of property tax revenue total, and then down to that 5.5% in terms of the ratio. And what we've said is, let's find a way to reinvest. We really think that could be a rising tide that would lift all ships, small towns, large cities, and everyone in between. So that's been our number one priority. Second category of proposal that we've put together is around local revenue flexibility. And we were pretty clear-throated in saying, we think Prop 2.5 is a good framework, but we don't know that the number 2.5 works in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
So we propose the idea of letting a community by ballot vote change itself to a Prop 3.5, Prop 3 community, or by ballot vote to be able to change to a community that allows growth that's indexed to some type of economic index. Could be CPI, could be something else. And then we've also proposed the idea of a multi-year override. So instead of asking voters to approve a tax increase for 1 year, perhaps a town could say, would you consider an increase over 2 years, over 3 years, something that could spread out the burden of the proposed tax increase. And then the final category we proposed was really our catch-all category, and that was around other types of revenue, whether it be meals tax or hotel tax. It was around helping pass laws or changing regulations that could help cities and towns save cost, predominantly through the Municipal Empowerment Act, which Governor Healy filed and we've been advocating for a number of years. And then also through the reform of benefit systems, reforming retirement systems, reforming healthcare, to really try to help cities and towns control some of the large costs that they have to bear that are pretty much now out of their authority or controlled.
Well, when you're talking about as far as different communities and having the option of increasing Proposition 2.5, and as you mentioned, it worked well at the time when it was voted in the early 1980s, but at this point in time, it doesn't even keep up with the rate of inflation.
Right. And I feel sometimes like a broken record saying that I think there's so much good about Prop 2.5, keeping the voters involved, making sure there is a check and a balance to how fast property tax rates can go up. I think it's all sound policy. But as you just said, if 2.5 is not keeping up with inflation, you're automatically putting cities and towns in a structural deficit.
We've talked along as far as in the east, the western part of the state too, regional disparities where rural towns are especially hit hard, often forced to cut education spending, while the gateway cities may see boosted state aid. If you look at the difference between, say, a Southampton, an East Hampton, a South Hadley, or a Springfield.
Right. And that's why we've really been vocal in supporting an account that's called Rural School Aid. That's an account that was funded a number of years ago. It hasn't yet been funded at the level that a report was issued a couple of years ago by the state suggesting it be funded at. But we've been trying to push for higher and higher levels. And this year we seem to be getting some higher numbers coming out of the governor's budget and the House budget in that regard. But we do see, and we work with our rural members very closely to advocate for varying pathways to help them address some of these challenges.
I know one of the things your report talked about as far as solutions is more local aid for cities and towns. I think it was what, $351 million for 351 cities and towns.
Yeah, and that ties back to that unrestricted general government aid question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that 11.5% down to the 5.5%. What we did was an average of where state aid from that account was as a percentage of property tax. And we said, we're not going to get all the way back up to where we were, back to that 11.5%. But what if we get to the average, which was about 6.7%? To get to 6.7% would be a reinvestment of just about $351 million. And of course, there is a nice marketing to 351 million for 351 cities and towns.
Sure.
But it's anchored in real math and sort of a real look at the numbers historically, and that's why we've gone forward with that proposal.
One of the things we talked about in the first segment was just the drastic cuts that these communities are going to have to make if these Proposition 2.5 overrides do not go through. And as you mentioned, it's like voters are between a rock and a hard place.
That's right. I think a lot about, I've heard people say, well, Prop 2.5 is working if people vote no, and then the cities and towns have to cut services. But I'm not sure that's the accurate analysis. I think if you're a resident, let's say you're a resident on a fixed income, let's say you're any resident. I don't know that you're saying you don't want local services if you vote no. I think you're probably voting based on what you think you can afford. But you probably might also hope and wish that the services could still be maintained in some way. So I think it's a real challenge to understand, to get inside the voter's head and think that it's a decision to reduce services. But regardless, when an override fails and state aid is not growing at the rate of inflation, and you can't really control things like healthcare or utilities, the result is going to be diminished local services.
We have to take another break. When we come back, Adam and I talk more about solutions for cities and towns here in Massachusetts. Stay with us. Welcome back to Western Mass News Getting Answers, back in our last segment with the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Municipal Association, Adam Chapdelaine. Adam, let's talk about what happens if the state doesn't come to the aid of cities and towns and voters continue to reject overrides. Where are we as a state headed? I mean, this is going to affect all of us.
I think it will. Let me start by saying I'm biased, but I think mayors, city and town managers, other local elected officials, I think they're the best in the business. I think they're good at what they do. For years already, they have been frugal in trying to maintain city and town services, and I know they're going to keep doing that. But the reality is we are going to start to see larger class sizes, library closures or less library hours. We're going to see impacts on public safety staffing. We're going to see park and recreational programs that are either eliminated or diminished, and other impacts to local government services. And I think, it's hard for me to pinpoint when residents are going to start to feel that. But I think coming up in this next fiscal year, which starts on July 1, I think we're now at a point where residents are going to start to notice. An example that comes to mind is the town of Athol. Just recently had an override fail, and their town manager shared with us what some of the cuts they would be considering. And they're looking at eliminating police positions and fire positions, but they're also closing the town beach. So some of those, one side of that feels like very critical public safety, but the other, I'm sure, is an amenity that is really cherished and beloved by the community that'll have to be closed based on budget constraints. So I think things like that are going to start to roll out in many communities.
All these things we've taken for granted through the years that we're not going to miss them till they're gone.
Right.
I think you made a very good point too when you're talking about our city and town leaders, a lot of them are taking big hits. And you see it mostly on social media that they're not running things right and this and that. And that doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, they're just struggling. It's like, how can you pull money out when you don't have it anywhere?
Well, back to our report, we looked historically over the past 15 or so years at spending. And when you look on an inflation adjusted basis, Massachusetts city and town spending has only grown by 0.6% a year.
Really? Yeah.
Comparable communities across the entire United States, 0.8%. The state budget, 2.8%. So it's really hard to make an argument that cities and towns have a spending problem when you look at it. When you really look at the data, they're doing a good job managing their budgets. They're just operating in an environment that makes it hard to keep things balanced.
And we've talked too about expenses, especially the insurance expenses. I mean, I know in one instance they're talking about, well, these weight loss drugs, and that's bringing the cost of that up. Whether it's school choice or transportation costs or everything else. The fact is these costs are not going down anytime soon.
That's right. That's right. I mean, health insurance is a big expense. There's lots of ideas swirling out there. The Massachusetts economy is really driven by healthcare and pharmaceutical companies. So there's lots of understandable worry about upsetting that apple cart. But, controlling healthcare costs, finding some way to control utility costs and some other types of costs, we need to figure that out because I think it'll help cities and towns. It'll help private industry. And it'll help you and me, right? It'll help the average resident if those costs can be controlled.
You think it's time for municipalities to possibly take a look at how they're doing business and maybe look more to the private sector when it comes to health insurance or whether it's retirement accounts, that these communities can no longer really afford this anymore? But that seems to be part of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always room for taking a look at how local government or government at any level is doing things. I will say, though, I think, you look at data year over year, decade after decade, private sector pays better than the public sector. And one of the ways you can recruit and retain public employees is through a stable benefit structure. So I think there is a lot of merit to maintaining the stability of local government or state government healthcare, but seeing if there were ways that could make some of the benefits that are offered more comparable to the private sector in a way, as a way to save money. I think all ideas should be on the table.
Absolutely. Adam, unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd love to have you back on because I think there's so much we can talk about and really to focus on the work of the Massachusetts Municipal Association and what you're doing to help these cities and towns. So I do appreciate that, and I'd love to have you back on.
I'd love to come back. Thanks for having me.
My thanks to Adam Chapdelaine for being my guest this week, and of course to you at home for watching. I'm Dave Mattson. That does it for us for this week's edition of Western Mass News Getting Answers. Hope to see you next Sunday.